Our Bible word is Hebrews 13 verses 1 to 3. Let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing some have unwittingly entertained angels. Remember the prisoners as if chained with him, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. So this is the end of the epistle to the Hebrews. Here we encounter some ethical admonitions that are given. But let us first look at the context of Hebrews. The epistle to the Hebrews. According to some early church sources, it was attributed to the Apostle Paul. For example, already from the 2nd century onwards, all of Paul's writings were collected together. And for some, this epistle was also added to this collection of Pauline epistles. But others in the early church also said they don't know who wrote this epistle. And for example, the early church father Origen, he said, but as to who actually wrote the epistle, God knows the truth of the matter. And that is quoted by Eusebius in his church history. So already in the early church there was question mark, who wrote this? And today scholars and theologians generally accept that Paul did not write this epistle, because the language is too different. The Greek grammar and style is too different. Also the theology is quite different if you compare it to Paul's epistles. So who wrote this? God knows who wrote this epistle. And also where he wrote it, or for whom, we also do not know, because there's no real clues in the text. Maybe to people or Christians in Rome, because there's this reference to Rome towards the end of the epistle, etc. But exactly who wrote it and to where, which Christians this was aimed, we do not know. But what we can know is that it was aimed at Jewish Christians. And maybe it was written before the temple was destroyed, around 65 AD or so, because the author also writes as if the temple is still standing, the sacrificial system in the temple is still operating, but it could also have been written quite after this, or after this time, or after the temple was destroyed. So it was aimed at the Jewish Christian audience. And what we do know is that they were being persecuted, they were being harassed. And there are different phases that you can recognize in the epistle what this community has gone through. And the earliest phase is where they were persecuted, they were harassed, their property was plundered. But at this time they remained faithful, not just to their Christian faith, but also to each other. And this we can go read in chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. If you go there, the author writes, "But recall the former days in which after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you become companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and enduring possession for yourselves in heaven." So yeah, the author writes to this earlier time period. He himself was in prison. They came to visit him also. And these Christians, their property was plundered. The city officials, whoever, turned a blind eye, and they were people around in the community. They were targets of abuse. And now, a little while later, this kind of harassment has continued, and it's difficult. And some started getting tired, and they started withdrawing from coming to Christian fellowship. And we can also read this in chapter 10, verses 24 and 25, where the author writes there, "Let us consider one another." And in verse 25, "Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another." So he says here, some are holding back, some are staying away from the Christian assemblies, and also some, they are still in prison, and it's becoming a burden to look after those in prison. Also in chapter 13 verses 3, the author writes about the present situation of believers. He says there, remember the prisoners as if chained with him, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. So even at the time of writing, there were those imprisoned. So it was a difficult situation. Yeah, people are losing their faith. They are withdrawing. There are those in prison. The community is still being harassed on a continual basis. So now our author writes this epistle. It's actually more like a sermon. It's actually more like a homily. He's giving them encouragement. If you go right to the end of the epistle, to chapter 13, verses 22, he writes about, receive this word of exhortation. So this is to encourage them, so that they don't withdraw from the faith, etc. So now he also addresses them. He says, now again I must instruct you. You've become like children. Now we must teach you again all the first principles. If you go to chapter 5, verses 12, from verses 12. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. So the author also says, now it's like we're back at the beginning. You are withdrawing and you're losing your commitment to Christ. Now we must start from the beginning and teach you again. So that was a difficult situation. And also in chapter 11, for example, our author encourages these Christians. Remember the examples of the Old Testament. The patriarchs, those other figures he refers to, how they remained faithful to God, how they endured, even though they did not receive the promise of rest that God has given to his people. So generally, this is a word of exhortation to Christians. Remain faithful. And the author also writes to convince these Christians Christ is superior to what they've known before. Do not go back to the Judaism that you knew. That is past now. The time of the new covenant has come. Christ is superior in several ways. And Christ is superior to the prophets, to the angels. He is superior to Moses, Israel's lawgiver. He is superior to Joshua. And Christ is also superior to the Aaronic priesthood and the whole Levitical sacrificial system. That was where people made or brought their sacrifices of atonement. That's where their sins were also removed through the priests who helped them with the sacrifices in the temple. But Christ is superior to this. Christ brought his once for all sacrifice. If we go read also in chapter 10, verses 10. By that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. In other words, Jesus, he made the sacrifice. So the work is done. No more sacrifices needs to be made. That's why Jesus is superior to this priesthood that operated in the temple. Also very important in the book of Hebrews is that it emphasizes the role of Jesus as the high priest. He replaces the old high priest. Jesus is now the mediator between God and the people. He is the one who offered himself. He brought his own body as a sacrifice of atonement. And because of that, he has become the high priest. Also the one who now is seated at God's right hand and who intercedes on behalf of God's people. So that's quite important. Jesus is superior to what these Jewish Christians have known before. And he is the high priest. He's now enthroned in heaven. He's seated at God's right hand, who now intercedes on behalf of God's people. So based on us having Christ as his high priest, and our things exist now because of Christ's sacrifice, and his office as high priest, now seated at the right hand of the Father, there are implications for living, how Christians should live. And this is also a feature you find in Apostle Paul, for example in Galatians or Romans, where the first chapters are devoted to explaining this is the way things are now. This is what the ministry of Christ has meant. And this is how things have changed. And then the end or the latter chapters, Paul explains ethical implications. What does this mean now? What are the values and norms that Christians should live by based on this fact that things have changed? So a similar thing is happening here now. Our author has explained the nature of Jesus, the nature of the new covenant. Don't give up. Remain faithful. Don't be foolish now. You have this. Don't give this up. Then he also gives these ethical admonitions towards the end. And that's our textual unit. That's chapter 13, verses 1 to 6. So the author writes there, let brotherly love continue. I mean, that was common for early Christians. It's love your brothers and your sisters. Let this continue. But of course, this teaching us also as a different kind of meaning in context of this persecution that these Christians were facing. Let brotherly love continue. Don't draw back. Continue in your love and also your support of each other. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing some have unwittingly entertained angels. So it's, again, hospitality was a very important feature of ancient life, and it was no different for the early church. If Christians come to visit, you need to give them hospitality. In other words, place to sleep, food to eat, etc. And in Jewish tradition, Abraham was the most excellent example of hospitality. If you go read there in Genesis 18, he welcomed those 3 men when he was at Mamre. And then, of course, he realized that this is the angel of the Lord that came there. But Abraham was a good example in hospitality, and this is what our Bible word here also refers to. Those 3 men, those 3 angels, they're also referred to as the angel of the Lord, whom Abram demonstrated hospitality towards. And now he also writes, remember the prisoners as if chained with him, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. Remember, Christians were imprisoned here, and they remained loyal, or they helped these prisoners earlier on, but it seems maybe some getting to lose interest become difficult, but it's encouraged here. Remember those who are in prison. So many Christians were imprisoned all across the empire. And we also find references to that by this pagan author. His name was Lucian. He writes of this one guy. He was a questionable guy his name is Peregrinus. He, for a while, associated with Christians, but he was actually a fraud and a fake. But while he was associated with the Christians, he was also imprisoned for a time period. And Lucian, this Gentile author, he writes about this. And of course, Lucian makes a mockery of Christianity, also of this Peregrinus. And he explains also what early Christians did to him or for him while he was in prison. He wrote that the Christians left no stone unturned in their endeavor to procure his release. When this proved impossible, they looked after his wants in all other matters with untiring solicitude and devotion. From earliest dawn, old women, widows they are called, and orphan children might be seen waiting about the prison doors, while the officers of the church, by bribing the jailers, were able to spend the night inside with him. Meals were brought in, and they went through their sacred formulas. So, it's even though this Christian, or this guy Peregrinus, he was a fraud, this Lucian writes here about this, but demonstrates how Christians looked after other Christians in prison. We find another example in the writing of an early Christian philosopher called Aristides, and in his writing called Apology, which he probably gave around the year 125 to the Emperor Hadrian, because he addressed the emperor and said, and if they hear that one of their number is imprisoned or afflicted on account of the name of their Messiah, all of them anxiously minister to his necessity, and if it is possible to redeem him, they set him free. So there was many instances of Christians being imprisoned and difficult, and of course this authorities didn't give you food in prison. They didn't care. You could die in prison. It would be your family and friends who would come and give you food. And Christians, themselves being targets and victims, they would go to the prisons and help these other Christians in prison at the threat to themselves, that they themselves will be imprisoned also, but they come and they help. And this is what our author here also encourages. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them. In other words, put yourself in their shoes. Have empathy. Do not forget about them. And then the author speaks about marriage is an honorable among all and the bed undefiled. So stay away from sexual immorality. It says there, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Let your conduct be without covetousness. In other words, don't be greedy. Don't lust after money. That's not going to give you contentment. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And also, so there the author he cites from Joshua 1 verses 5 and also Psalm 118 verses 6. It's about trust in God. If you have God, that in a sense covers your needs. Trust in God. Do not be covetous. Do not lust after money and wealth. Be contented with what you have. So that's what this ethical admonition is about here. In this context of persecution, in this context of people being imprisoned and harassed, etc., it's continue in brotherly love. Show hospitality. Those who come to visit you, give them food and lodging. Help those in need, especially those in prison. Chastity. In other words, no fornication, no sexual immorality. Look after your marriage. And also contentment. Do not lust or chase after money. So, Christian doctrine has ethical implications. What God has done for us in Christ, this new situation, it must influence how we act. It must influence our ethical behavior. Doing this means, or knowing this, or doing this, that is being a Christian. That's the appropriate response to what God has done for us in Christ.